Hello. We're going to start. Welcome, everyone. My name is Anita, and I'm from Kogan. If you haven't heard of Kogan before, Australia's biggest e-commerce platform, and we're really excited to have you guys here today. So we've got a really awesome lineup of speakers. First up, we've got Michael from Lexicon, and he's going to be talking to us about feature toggling.
All right, hi everyone. As mentioned, I am Michael Peyper from Lexicon. Some of you may also be aware that I'm the author of the React Hooks testing library, and have been maintaining that for a few years. But I'm not talking about that at all tonight, which is a bit weird as it's a React meetup. Instead, I'll be talking to you about feature toggling. So what I'm going to be covering tonight is I'll be giving an overview of what feature toggles are. I'll be showing a few different ways you can use feature toggles, giving you some tips and tricks to use them more effectively. And there'll be time for questions, and there's a few discussions in there, which is more an opportunity for me to take a drink than anything else. All right, so firstly, there's a couple of different categories of feature toggles, there's 4 of them. So the first one is release management. So these toggles are used to help us roll features out to production safely and effectively. You can run experiments using feature toggles. This is more like an extension of release management toggles. And kill switches. So a lot of companies will use them to turn off functionality by design when their system's getting a little bit overloaded. And you can also be running permissions through feature toggles as well, turning things on and off for different users at runtime. This presentation mainly covers release management. So it's everything that I'm talking about is framed in this sense, and I won't really be covering anything else there. So just keep that in mind. All right, so this is the problem that we're trying to solve. We have a main branch, which is what gets released to production, and we have 2 feature streams being built out. And so what happens is feature 1 does a couple of commits, feature 2 starts, it does its own commit, and it thinks it's ready, and it goes to the main branch ready for release. And then there's another commit against feature 1, and it also goes to main branches ready to release. But then they discover a problem with feature 2, and then they make a few more commits, and they are now ready to go. Now, when feature 1 wants to release, they have a problem. There's a broken commit in the main branch. They have to work out whether or not it's safe for them to release, and go and talk to the other team, work out what's happening, and likely they're going to have to wait for feature 2 to be ready. Now, it's not too bad at this point when there's only 2 and teams can talk to each other. But when you roll this out and you get to 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 feature streams, it can become a big problem, and you get to a point where no one can ever really release anything because they're always blocked by some other changes in the branch. So a lot of people will then turn to feature branching, and they'll say that's the solution to this problem. We're going to have feature branches, and we won't merge anything to main until we are absolutely convinced that it's safe to release. So we have the same commits as before. The changes go out to feature 1 and feature 2 as they do, and then feature 1's ready to release. So they go out and they merge to main, and they push that to production, and then feature 2 now has to merge those changes into their branch. And this is where things start to go wrong again. They discover problems. They realize there's conflicts in the code, someone's changed something, and then they have to make a whole bunch of changes and retest everything that they do. So for me, this has problems as well. So what is the solution? feature toggles. Without deploying any code, without making any changes, I was able to turn the feature on and show you this content. So we can modify the behavior without modifying the code, and that's gives us a lot of freedom and a lot of flexibility to roll features out and merge our code to the main branch more often without all the headaches. And it really boils down to a Boolean. So we've got, if the thing is enabled, we do the new thing, and if it's not enabled, we do the old thing. It's a pretty basic concept to wrap your head around. And so it allows us to do something more like this. Now, I'll just highlight that these lines in between the merges to main don't actually exist in this model. It's just my diagram tool. I couldn't get rid of them. So they're there. But the idea is that every time we thought the feature was ready to go out, we merge to main. We have our feature toggle and we just merge to main. Every time we have a commit that we think can go to production, we merge it to main. And every time we want to make a new commit, we branch off main again, and we make more commits and we merge back to main. So at this point, when feature 1 wants to release, they just turn their toggle on. And they don't have to worry about anything that feature 2 has been doing because they're toggled off. And then similarly, when feature 2 is ready to go, they just release as soon as they're ready. No conversations, no questions, they're ready to go. Now you might have picked up a little bit from some of the words I was using before about integrating code, merging more frequently, maybe some might say continuously. What we're really talking about doing is enabling continuous integration and continuous delivery. And so what I mentioned before, from a pull request, we merge the code straight to main, and we're going to kick off a bunch of deployments to environments. And then we use the feature toggles to control in those environments which features are available and which features are not. And you can have whatever gates you want on those environments. You can deploy directly to dev automatically and then have manual deploys to all of the other environments if you want to. Or if you're living in that utopia where every commit goes straight to production, that's great too. I have not been able to work anywhere yet that has that luxury, but if you do, all power to you. Okay, so putting the Boolean in the code, if the feature is enabled or not, is only part of the problem. The other part is actually how do we configure these toggles. So we need some way of saying per environment what's on and what's off. And there's lots of different ways to solve this. I've got a few of my favorites here. So your config file, most applications at some point, when they get big enough, they end up with a config file for their environments. Great place to put this. Put a key in your config that has all of your features in it. Environment variables, fantastic place. It's kind of in the name, right? We want to control things per environment. We have environment variables. So a really good place to be controlling your feature toggles. My hot tip for you is to prefix them with feature so that you know that they're feature flags. And if you're sorting them in your .env file or something like that, they all get sorted together. You can stick them in your database, another good place, handy place to put them, or any key value store that you might already be using in your stack. And then we just control them. So here's a couple of config files for all of my different environments. You can see here I've got 2 feature toggles in my system, and I've got one that's already released, so it's true in all of the environments. And then I've got a new feature. I'm building something new. And so for this one, I have it set true in my local environment, just while I'm developing it. And then when I think it's ready, for the other developers to get their hands on it, I can turn it on in dev. And then, I can leave it there, toggle off everywhere else. No one else has to worry about it. We're happy with it as developers. We think, yep, this is really good. We want it's past QA. All checks and balances are good. Because this is ready for our users to test. We can give this out for some UAT testing. And so we can then turn it on here. And then, maybe at this point, the users are testing it and they're sort of all happy with it. Maybe there's a dependency somewhere, so we're not quite ready to go to production yet. But then someone from the sales team comes to you and says, hey, I've got this client that I think they'll come on board if we can just show them that new feature you're building. You can go, yep, no worries at all. We're going to turn this on in the demo environment, and they can go and have a look at it as well. And then we're ready to release, so in our pre-prod environment we can set that to true, and we can make sure we can practice our release. This is all the release actually is. The code's already gone out at some point, so our release becomes turn the toggle on, does it appear in staging. Fantastic. And then the release becomes really, really simple, and we can go, yep, it's on in production now. Everything happens. So my first tip for you for the night is, before I had just a basic Boolean, if it's enabled or not, wrap that up into a function. Encapsulate it into a function and hide away any complexity you have in your check. It does a couple of things. It improves the readability of your code. This is feature enabled. It's really, really clear to me what is happening here. You can change the implementation more easily. So if you have any specific checks you want to do to work out whether or not a feature is enabled, we can wrap it up in there, and all of the features that we have in the system can get the benefit of that. And if you are using types and TypeScript, it makes it really easy to spot issues. So if I fat-fingered this, we'll get a little error there saying you've got an issue with your types there. And it also helps us with cleanup. If we come along and this gets removed, we also get told all the places in the code that I need to go and remove that toggle. All right, first discussion. So I want you guys to have a think about this, maybe turn to the person next to you and talk about it. When doesn't feature toggling make sense? I'm gonna have a quick drink. All right, that's long enough. All right, so these are my thoughts on that question. If you're not integrating code often, there's not a lot of point feature toggling. It's all about managing the risks of integrating code. If you're working solo on a small team, maybe it's a bit more overhead than you need. You can probably get away with just having conversations between people. If nothing's live yet, if you're building out something and no one's actually using it, then a lot of that risk is mitigated already. If it's just minor styling updates, so if the change you're making isn't really going to have catastrophic effects, if it went out, changing the color of a button or something like that, probably not worth feature toggling. And hot fixing production bugs. Just fix the bug. Just fix it. Get on with it. All right. So now I'm going to talk about a few different types of toggles. So first, and the most basic of feature toggles, well, I've shown you already, Boolean toggles. So this is true or false. It's on or it's off. They're really, really simple. I consider it the smallest unit of a toggle, if you want to think of it that way. It's very, very easy for everyone on the team and product owners and all these sort of people to understand true or false, on or off. Next one I've got is date toggles. Now, to me, this is the most underused and underrated feature toggle out there. They're very, very handy to set and forget. So you can put, when you add the feature toggle and you know what date you want it to go live, you can add it in early and you don't have to do anything after that. It will turn itself on as soon as the date passes. It's really, really handy. It's good for timing with real world events. So, end of financial year, the company's birthday, Christmas, those sort of things. If you've got a sale starting on a particular day, something like that, useful to Another thing that they can be used for, if you don't think of the date that you're comparing against as today, and you want to use an effective date of a process, it can be very, very handy if you're backdating any processing. So you can use the old functionality that would have existed on a particular date, and then anything run today would use the new functionality. A lot of financial services run into that problem of having to use last year's legislation when they run their accounts, their balances and things. But beware of time zones. So particularly if you're going to evaluate these on the front end, the person that's using your system might not be where you are, and the date might be different for them. So just keep that in mind. Version toggles. So this one actually bit me recently. It's not something I ever thought about, but I was working on a mobile app. And one of the annoying things about mobile apps is you don't control when it necessarily updates. So if you've been releasing code into the app, constantly, continuously releasing that code, and you turn it on with a true and it goes on, anyone that's running the old version of the app are going to get some broken clown version of the feature because they only had half the code there. So stick to the version number. Tell it which version of the app needs to be running to show this feature. It's also handy if you're running to a product roadmap. If you know this feature is part of a bigger scope of work and it's only going to be released with a particular version of your application, it can be handy to group multiple features together to release at the same time. And just remember semver semantics. You don't want it to turn off again on the next patch release because you are strictly checking for version 1.2.3. And user toggles. So with this one, we extended the is feature enabled to accept our user, and now we can make smarter choices about when the feature is on or off. So in my little example here, I'm using the username, and I'm saying, for this alpha feature that we've got, we're only going to give it to user 1 and user 2. And then this beta feature is available to the entire company. So this is handy if you want to roll features out incrementally to smaller segments of users, and then slowly increase the number of people that are going to see it. So if you want early feedback on something, give it to your your favorite person at your company and let them tell you what they think of it. All right, so that's all the different types of toggles that I'm going to talk about. There are others that there is more. They're the most useful ones, but feel free to experiment with them. So now I'm going to talk about feature toggles as a service. So this is extending on where we store our toggles. So rather than having them tied to our application, we actually extract them out into their own service and make them available externally to the application. I'm going to specifically talk about one called Launch Darkly, which is probably the biggest player in this game, definitely the one everyone evaluates at some point. And the main reason is that they've been doing it for a long time. They have any type of toggle that I've spoken about tonight and more available just out of the box. You get access to them. They have a really nice UI, really nice interface for managing the toggles, so it doesn't necessarily have to be the developers coming out to update the config files and push out those toggles. You can give access to your product owner and let them control when the feature goes out or who gets access to it. Give it to your sales team to turn it on specifically for the demos that they're running. And it can also do a whole bunch of other things. Different toggling strategies, percentage-based rollouts, and things like that. So A/B testing, experiments, all sorts of things comes packaged in with it. And I'm going to have to switch over here to show you. I've got this little example here. So it's not all roses. I'm just going to toggle this on here. I've got a couple of cons there. It is quite expensive. I'm not going to lie to you. I've seen it be evaluated quite a few times, and it always falls down to the commercials. No one goes forward with it. It's probably quite good for smaller companies. It won't be too bad, but larger companies are going to definitely feel the sting. And you can't run it on premise if that's important to you. It's cloud only. There are a couple of other players in that game. Unleashed is a open source version that you can run for free. So if you are thinking about feature toggles as a service, look at that one as well. All right, my next tip for you, testing toggles. It's very, very important to test the toggles on and off. I've seen many teams fall down where they make the changes they need, all the tests pass, and they keep going. And then when they go to remove that toggle, they realize that they only ever tested it in the off state. And that's not where you want to be. If you're going to test one side of it, test the on state, that's where you're going. Don't worry about the off state, but it's not difficult to test it on both sides. Easiest way to do it, take your existing test suite, wrap a suite around it with a toggled off, set off, and that becomes the off version of your tests. Then you create the toggled on version and make whatever changes you need to get your tests to pass. All right, second discussion of the night. My chance for a second drink. How many toggles should you have? Discuss. All right, that's long enough. All right, it was somewhat of a trick question. There isn't a number. It's as many as you need to feel confident that you're releasing your features as you need to. I will add that I don't think you necessarily need one per feature. It's the granularity that you're going to need to turn things on and off as you're going to need to. It's a case by case, but keep it as low as you can. And this is why. So make sure you are cleaning up your toggles regularly. As soon as you add a toggle to the system, put a ticket in your backlog to remove it again and track it. Keep an eye on it. If you get too many, start playing them. Toggles, because what you end up happening is toggles will depend on other toggles existing, and that is a nightmare scenario to find yourself in. Particularly when we had before there with the tests and we're toggling the on and off states of one feature toggle. If you have two feature toggles that's needed, you're going to have to test on and on and off and on, off and off. Right? That's how you're going to have confidence. You add that, you get more and more feature toggles in place, and it's a pain. It's a real pain. I've been there. I've had hundreds of toggles still existing in the system, and all of that code has to be maintained. All the code in the off branches still needs to be maintained, particularly if you're working in a typed language and you update a type that's used in the off branch. You're going to have to maintain all that code. So be vigilant, get rid of them as soon as you don't need them. As soon as they're on, get rid of them. Maybe leave them for like a sprint just in case you need to turn it off again. All right, my next load of tips. Optimize for cleanup. So this is some code that I saw at a client. Don't worry to anyone here from Lexicon. It's not the exact code. I wrote it from memory, roughly what it looked like. No judgment to the code that was there. It worked. It was fine. It did toggle how it needed to do. But let's have a look at what happens when we want to remove the offer modal feature toggle. that's a scary diff for me when you're removing code, when you just want to delete something, delete a branch of a code. There's a lot kind of going on here. There's a bit of refactoring happening down here. We had the offer modal call here that had to move down here. Just generally, there's too many changes. I don't feel comfortable anymore that this code is going to work as it did with the toggle on. Let's compare it to this version. So in this version, I've preferred duplication. I know there's some things there that I could have cleaned up. I could have refactored and made it read nicer with the toggle in place. But when we look at the diff of this version, it's all red. That's what you want when you're removing toggles. You want all red. You want a sea of red. Because it becomes very clear to me, reading this, what has changed. What am I looking at that is being removed and what is staying? So very, very nice way. If you're reviewing this cleanup, it's easy to do. There's another technique that's called branch by abstraction. And the idea is that it's quite similar to before, but we have wrapped the feature toggle in account balance here, and then we have some abstractions of what the alternatives are there. And then with this one, when we look at that diff, it becomes even clearer that this is what's left. It is exactly the same as what was there before. You don't have to panic about this diff. All right, so I'm getting very close to the end, so I'm going to do a quick recap of what we've spoken about. Why do we use feature toggles? The main thing we want to do is integrate our code early and often as we can, and get our code out to production as fast as we can. We want to reduce that risk of releasing code. So we want to make releasing not scary. We want turning a feature on to be as simple as flipping a switch, and it's available. The code's been out already. And using these techniques, we can safely manage those feature rollouts of our code. If you want to dive deeper into any of this, Martin Fowler has an article on his blog, because of course he does. Atlassian has some great stuff about how it can fit into your CI/CD pipeline. Not unsurprisingly, Launch Darkly also have a lot of resources on feature toggling and why it's really, really good. It's probably in their best interests to say so. And this whole presentation is available on GitHub. It uses a lot of the techniques that I spoke about tonight in the source code for this. The obligatory "we are hiring" slide. So Lexicon is hiring. It's a great place to work. So yeah, if you're interested, go to the careers page, come chat to me at some point. Happy to talk to you. And there's a heap of Lexicon people here tonight that you can chat to as well. Are there any questions?
What was the name of the open source one?
Unleash. Oh, the question was, what was the name of the open source version? There are heaps though. There's quite a few out there. Actually, the feature toggling of GitLab is built on top of Unleash, if you've ever used that one. Yep.
Do you have a preferred naming convention when you do your stuff at Lexicon?
Do I have a preferred naming convention when I do my stuff at Lexicon? For feature toggles, specifically? Yeah, so as I said on that slide, if I'm using environment variables, which I generally do, I'll prefix it with feature, so it's really, really clear. And often it'll go like, so feature and then like the sort of grouping, the name of the feature. Let's use like, I don't know, offers, for example, like feature, offers, and then whatever the sub thing that I'm toggling is. So it might be like feature, offers, modal, or something like that. Yep.
How do you evaluate your experiments
How do I evaluate the experiments when I'm doing my feature toggling? I don't. I haven't actually used them for experiments before. The release management is my biggest use case that I've had to date. Yep.
How do you handle E2E testing?
How do I handle E2E testing? Good question. So the difficulty with the E2E testing is how do you turn the feature on and off for different cases of your E2E testing. Two different ways you can do it. You can kind of blindly go features on and say, for my E2E testing, we'll care about future state only. Alternatively, runtime toggles. So kind of similar, I guess, to what I did in this presentation, where you have the ability to turn the toggles on or off within the application itself without having to update the config. So sort of an override at runtime. You can hook into something like that as a setup in the test, or if you're using Launch Darkly or a tool like that, you could have two different users and have your toggles configured to one user or the other. It's a bit dark, I can't see any more hands. Yell out if you have a question. Nope. All right. That's me done. Is Anita about? What's happening now? Are we switching?
Cool. Let's do it. So I am super duper excited to introduce Ruck. I've worked on it full-time, self-funded for an entire year, and I guarantee that you haven't seen anything like this before, and you'll be thinking about it on the toilet for probably the next week and in the shower. I hope. So without at risk of overhyping, let's get in. So Ruck is an open source buildless React web app framework for Deno, and that is how it differentiates itself from next.js and Fresh, if you're familiar with Deno frameworks, and Remix and all the other ones. Basically everything that has ever been attempted JavaScript-wise has elaborate build tooling built into it. Webpack, Babel, ES Build, SWC. So buildless. This is an emerging buzzword. Mark my words, in a year or two, you're going to hear this a lot. And 99% of the time, it will be a lie. So already, Fresh, they sometimes use the word buildless, but actually, while they might abstract that some build stuff happens, because it's on the fly and it happens for you, there's a lot of building going on. There's compilation of source code to what runs in the actual browser. So Ruck really is reimagined from the ground up without any build at all. What does that mean? Literally, the source code that you write and version control is exactly the code that runs on the server in Deno and in Chrome on the browser, or whatever your chosen browser is. So I have dreamed of this being a possibility for a very long time, and I've immersed very deeply in all of these build tools. So I've published Babel plugins, I've published Webpack tools, and I suppose it is important to make a distinction that these tools like Babel are still fantastic and have a legitimate use case for analysis. For example, I've published a tool called Find Unused Exports, and in CI, basically, it will use Babel to parse all the JavaScript in your project, and it will find out if there's exports that aren't used anywhere, and therefore it's dead code. So that's not a build tool. That's an analysis tool. But when you're using Babel, whether it be via a framework or in your own custom setup, to take source code and then programmatically, mechanically, automatically generate the real stuff that actually runs, that's a build tool, a build step. So a lot had to be reimagined to get this to work. So for this presentation, I'm going to take us through a bit of a tour of a real app right now that's live, that's built using Ruck, and it's deployed with fly.io. So I think I'll just tab out and just show you very quickly what it looks like when you use it. Where's my mouse? That was bullshit. It was invisible. So, some features of it in action. It's server-side rendered. I'm hotspotting off my phone. And if we go to a route, it's got a transition, and that transition completes when all the CSS assets and all the JavaScript and stuff is dynamically loaded on demand to render that new route, and then it finishes the transition. Now, this data is actually queried live using the GitHub GraphQL API to present the releases, and you can go deeper, and you end up having a route that's dynamic with the slug at the top, and if you go back, it shows instantly without a loading screen because that's already in the application cache. So this stuff is actually really tricky with legacy frameworks like next.js. You have to set up Apollo or something. You need to do app level decorators or decorate pages to have context and set up your cache, and simple things like if you have a 404 page in Next.js, getting it to have a HTTP status 404 or forbidden or all these other different things from queries that are happening, data loading that is happening at a component level, it's really tricky. So I've not just reimagined what a framework could be like buildless, but I've also solved a lot of things that have really frustrated me on the job over the last decade. So I'll tab back to the slides. So at the very bottom of ruck.tech/releases, you can see the view source link. That'll take you to the GitHub repo so you can see all the source code. I'm picking this particular page to go through with you because it is an example of server-side rendering that has some data that loads, and it's sort of an example of everything. So don't listen to anyone that tells you that bundling and minification and all these other build steps matter. It's literally complexity for its own sake. And I had to spend a year to go out and build it to prove that, look, you can build performant apps using just native web. It works really, really well. So this is a part of the Chrome inspector most people aren't particularly familiar with, but there's a coverage tab, and that tells you what percent of the code, whether it be JavaScript or CSS, that runs in the course of using the app is hot, is covered, is actually used. So if you have an app that just has one big massive single bundle with all the routes and stuff bundled in there, you'll notice if you visit one route, like 80 or 90% will be red. It will be not used. So when you have a Ruck project, the goal and the design is that basically all the code that loads is 100% necessary and is immediately used. So there are a few caveats that when we're having drinks later, I can explain. But if we compare it to next.js, so I just went to the next.js website, and this is pretty indicative of the bundling strategy. Most of the usage in the visualization column, it's red. And it probably will be for most users. Even if you click around a few routes and these split bundles start to pay off over time, the stuff that you loaded up front, it'll start to be useful and you'll start to grow more and more blue. But there is tremendous, tremendous waste in the way that we've been bundling. So none of this stuff would be possible if we didn't have dependencies that could be used in this framework and in building your actual app code. If they weren't optimal, it would be unfeasible. You'd have these horrific module graphs if you're using ESM and over HTTP, where all these index modules would load in entire APIs of things that you're not even using 1% of it, and you'd end up with possibly thousands of modules. So that's part of the reason why it took a year, is because I had to go through all of the stuff that I use to do GraphQL and things like that, and I had to make sure that, firstly, because I built it for Node originally all those years ago, I had to make sure that it worked in Deno, but also to really nail down and optimize how you need to structure everything. So that's required reading, and it's critical. So another first impression, if you just look at the inspector at a Ruck app, is how beautiful the code looks. It's not mechanically generated crap with randomized hashes and file names and things. It's structured how you would manually write it. It's very, very readable. But that's not it's not at a cost of performance. So this sort of at the crux is what it looks like. On the left is your app resources that are loading in the browser, and on the right is your tree, your project tree in VS Code. It's the same thing. So the components, basically everything that's in a Ruck public folder is what's used and run in the browser. So to really nail that point home, here's a random component, formatted date. And you can see that the source code is really pretty to read. If you're debugging something on the live website, you can click on stuff. There's no source maps or anything to deal with. It's not a bunch of scrambled Babel output. And this is the exact same. So this is the component live, and this is the component in VS Code. It's literally the same file. So this does not mean that you have to sacrifice type safety. So Ruck projects and Ruck itself is 100% type safe. So how does that work, right? If you don't have a build step, it's a little known fact that you can use TypeScript almost to the fullest in normal JavaScript modules using TypeScript flavor of JavaScript JS doc comment blocks. So there's a JS doc way that you can define types, you can import types across modules, all of it. And it works great. You don't need a build step. You do, however, need to make sure that your editor has, much like regular TypeScript, an extension for TypeScript. But because this is Deno, and those legends at Deno company, they've made I'll come back to that. They've made an extension that is kind of like a combination of TypeScript, Prettier, a bunch of stuff, and it's all in one. So fantastic. That's a one-stop shop to use Ruck. install that extension. And because I'm a masochist, I spent a lot of blood, sweat, and tears publishing a Nova extension for Deno. So if you like to use Nova, you can also install that. So going back, Deno aspires, and so does Ruck, to be zero configuration. And that includes TypeScript config. Now, there is one caveat that because Ruck is an isomorphic code base, a Ruck project, you need to teach TypeScript that the DOM is basically those globals and things. You should be allowed to use it in your files. So that's just a small required boilerplate, is that you need to create a deno.json file and you need to put the compiler options in there. So that's a copy paste when you set up a project. So the other big thing, right, is we're used to, this is a React Meetup, we're used to writing JSX every day. So how do you do it without a build step? How does that run in a browser? You have to import from React, create element, and I like to alias it as H. You can pick any single letter. It just reduces the amount of duplication that you're writing, which, because we're not bundling or minifying or doing anything else as well, anything you can do to cut down on the size of your modules, it just helps performance a smidge. So this is what it looks like if you write some JSX manually. This is basically, there's some nuance about the new JSX transforms and blah, 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 blah. But basically, you're writing what JSX gets transpiled to. You're just cutting out the middleman and you're just writing the end result that would normally run in next.js or anything else that transpiles JSX. But because you're writing it by hand, you can do it much more beautifully. So you'll notice that this is the same component, the traditional way with transpilation, and that's manually. This was an epiphany for me. It's better writing it manually. JSX is garbage. You actually end up having to write more syntax to do the same thing. You have to set up so much tooling to get types and IntelliSense and just stuff that might crash. ESLint and stuff crashes unless you configure JSX properly, and we take for granted the massive amount of complexity that's either done for us or we manually do just to get this damn syntax to work. And there are so many little nice things. So the props there, where datetime is going in, if you were to do it with regular JSX, you'd actually have to duplicate the word datetime, just the way it is. But when you're writing vanilla JavaScript, it's more succinct. And you'll notice as well that for the string in the children, I should probably say to everyone, the first argument is what the component is, the second argument is the props, and the third component is children. The third argument is children. So here we're just using a vanilla JavaScript template string. The JSX way, see how there's that kind of prettier, or it's in this case Deno formatting, how it adds that extra blank string on the end there to get the column length right. You know, when you look at that, if you're new to JavaScript and you looked at this file, you would be like, what is this? So it's not as bad as you think. You will grow to love this. So the next obvious question, right, when you look at one of these components in the browser is, how does the browser know what React is? And because this is an isomorphic code base, Deno as well for that matter, the answer is standard import maps. There's been a lot of progress recently, actually, for this to be ratified, and it's already available in Chrome. In fact, I've got future slides talking about that. So just to anchor this point, import maps is kind of like a combination of a package lock file and a package JSON dependencies field. So you're basically saying exactly where these aliases, what URLs they point to get that code. And for Ruck projects, it's conventional that you have 4. So import maps for the client, import maps for the server, and then dev variations of those. Theoretically, nothing's prohibiting you from just having one import map.json and just dump all of your definitions that are relevant for your backend as well as your front end. And the only cost to that is that you're going to have a bigger JSON blob that gets put in the view source of your HTML page, which is pointless. And you could say that it might give hints away about, what dependencies you're using at what versions in your backend, which could be questionable. But what's a real benefit here is having separate dev ones from production ones. And I'll explain a little bit more of the difference there. Yeah, I will. So Chrome, this is what it looks like. It's a native thing. Show of hands, how many people are familiar with import maps, the standard stuff? So about 3 hands. So the way it works in a browser natively, there's a script type equals import map, and you put that before any other scripts that run in the HTML page, and it's basically just a JSON map of what the import from sort of aliases, what URLs they point to. It's that easy, and the JavaScript engine and the browser just knows from then on to what those aliases match. So Safari is lagging, and they don't implement import maps yet. Firefox does, by the way, but just not yet. So they've got it in development. I don't know if it's in their version of Canaries or whatever, but very soon Firefox will support this out of the box. But for Safari and Firefox, there is this script that Ruck includes before the import map, and that's basically a shim. Fortunately, it's amazing, this guy that produced this. It goes through and it finds all of the import maps that you have, and it magics it so that you can use ESM with import maps. It's really cool. And it is a no-op in Chrome that supports it. So basically, you don't need to think about this. Ruck takes care of it. So this is a client import map. And before you freak out, like, oh man, this is boilerplate. How do I know what URLs to put in there? And in the Ruck README, there's like copy and paste starter examples of exactly you should just use this to start with, and then you can add your dependencies as you go from there. But you can see in there, React, that's where it's defined, and it's being served by esm.sh. Another awesome thing about this approach is there's no centralization. It's not all coming through NPM or any other corporation. You could swap those out. You could host them yourself. Your corporation could mirror the dependencies that you have and serve it yourself if you're scared of, serving your app dependencies from some random other CDN. And when it's at the development version, you'll notice that the URLs change to make sure that it's the development version of React. Really, only React is the thing that matters because they give you nice warnings and things if you're using hooks wrong and stuff like that. Theoretically, you could just not. You could use the production React dependency, but that would just be a bad DX. And the server import map is very similar, except for there's standard, which is the Deno standard library. That's used in the server code of Ruck. So there's a couple of extra dependencies. So how do you start it? And this is different probably to most other frameworks you're used to. You just import the function to serve and you just run it. There's no CLI. You make a CLI if you want, but that's all you need to start Ruck. And it's type safe, so if you're interested, you can see what the type is for the options. But really, you just need to tell Ruck what the client import map file's called. And I conditionally swap it out based upon a Ruck dev environment variable. And you just tell it what port you want. And I also use an environment variable. You could hard code this if you wanted. You don't have to do this, but I also like to make a nice little SH script that So the way that you run that Deno module that has the serve function call in it, you have to use the Deno CLI to run it, which is basically like if you're using the Node CLI to run a Node script. But because I like to use Deno's watch mode and I want to use the dev version of the import map and the prod version, I like to have this script that just conditionally, runs it correctly with the right arguments for me, so I don't need to think about it. All I need to do is configure the env. And this is the other optional dev sh script, and it just is a layer on top of that serve one that loads the .env that I create in my project next to it that has the environment variable values in it, and we'll skip over making the environment variable module stuff. I was just staying true to what was in that example repo that we're looking at, but if you've got secrets and stuff that are in the server env, you don't want that to be in the client. So I've come up with a way to do that. It's not Ruck specific, but it works with Ruck. And that way, when you're in dev, you just run that in your terminal to get started and do a day's work. Very easy once you've set it up. So the other really core thing that is really different to Ruck, there's no file-based routing like in next.js. It is an incredibly simple but incredibly powerful concept. There is required to be a public/router.mjs module, and that's pretty much the only required convention. You can configure the location of your public directory if you have it somewhere else for some reason, but out of the box it looks for a folder called public. And in there, it's going to default export a router. That's the type it has. You're exporting a function that accepts the URL, it accepts Ruck's head manager, and it accepts a Boolean, is this the initial route or not? You don't really care about that so much, but there are certain abstractions and things that's helpful to know. And it returns a route plan. And a route plan has the JSX content of the route, and it also optionally has a cleanup function for when the route exits. So this is a hello world app. You're importing your create element, and you're exporting your router, and for this ridiculously simple hello world app, there's not even a concept of pages. It just always returns content that says in a heading, hello world. Now, here is a app that has pages. Your router, okay, so my code example, I forgot to put the URL in the router's parameter. My mouse isn't showing up on that screen. But the router function is meant to use the URL argument there. And you're just basically switching off what the URL path name is. And that's a standard JavaScript URL instance. Now, if you have a dynamic route that has a slug in it, now this is really cool. You can do some stuff that you can't in Next. Basically, you can match what the URL path name is in your router function, and and you can pull out using regex whichever slugs you want, using whatever criteria you want. And before you go, ooh, gross, I'm having to write regex. This has a tremendously awesome benefit, because in the example that we have here, the slug is a semver for a Ruck version. So if you just type in the URL some bullshit, ASDF instead of a valid semver string, this will be able to tell that it's a 404 without doing any queries, without loading any components for that route. It can tell straight away just because the regex isn't a match. With Next.js slugs, you can't discriminate what the contents of the slugs are. It will go and load those routes, and you will probably have to do an Apollo GraphQL query and then get back an error that says that doesn't exist for that ID. So this is incredibly efficient. Now, this is also, that's introducing another concept about CSS. So don't get confused about where it says route plan for content with CSS. We'll talk about that shortly. I was just using this regex example because it's a real one from the project we're talking about. Now, if you want to load pages on demand, you're using native, just vanilla dynamic imports. And when you do that, it's always good on the promised chain for the dynamic import to have the catch, just in case the user is going through a train tunnel and that fails. That way, because you've already defined that fallback content in the route file itself, you could potentially keep that out in a separate module and do a proper import at the top so that it's definitely there and it's in memory, ready to go. It will be able to show the error even if you're offline, because it's already loaded and cached that error content. So I guess the concept here is that you can return a promise, basically, that has the route content. So if you have CSS, now this is really different to everything else on a technical level and an API, just design perspective. So you can use this route plan for content with CSS helper that Ruck exports, and it takes care of all of the cleanup hooks and that uses the head manager and stuff to make sure that the CSS files that you're specifying load when the route is starting and they're unloaded when the route exits. But in reality, it's actually super easy to use. You just hard code what you want the CSS files to be. They could be remote, or they could be local from your public folder. All those URLs for the CSS are relative to like what would happen in the browser because the server doesn't care. So to make use of the router in your components, like to be able to tell what is the current route, that sort of thing, there is a use route hook that you can import from Ruck. And that's a classical use case, is being able to have an active state on a link. So you can see there how to use it. It's very easy. The other thing that the routing system allows, it has route change events, and they're global on the window. There's no route changing that happens on the server. So that can be used to have that little transition indicator that I demonstrated at the top, the little bar that scrolls across the top. And your component code would look very similar to what you do in a Next.js app for that sort of thing. So how does the head tags work? And this is on a technical level. This took months, and I've never seen it done. But it has full-blown React rendering in the head. So if you use Next.js, they've got like their method of defining head tags in your components using the head component. But they actually loop through the head tags that you want to render, and they'll manually synchronize using loops what's going on in the head. And it's not really rendering it with proper DOM diffing and everything in the head. And there's a lot of gotchas associated with that. With Ruck, it's really easy to render whatever you like. You can use components as nested as many levels deep as you want. You can use whatever. So you just use the use head hook imported from Ruck. The first parameter of a use head is a arbitrary key, and it's basically an ID so that you can group chunks of your head. So, for example, you might have title that you set higher up in your page, and then deeper inside you might use an overriding title for when the loading comes back, and you can use like the content of the article or something to have a more specific title. So that's how you update the head. I could do a whole Meetup talk about how that React app, there's actually 2 React apps running at once in a Ruck app. There's the head React app and there's the body React app, and they talk to each other. But it's remarkably simple. It's less than 100 lines. So how does that look in the end result, that example, you can see the head tags are there. But interestingly, the Ruck managed head tags, they fit between this meta Ruck head start and the Ruck head end, because this is the whole challenge with rendering a React app in an arbitrary position in the head. React needs a containing DOM node that has nested DOM nodes in it. And you can't have divs in the head. You can't nest meta tags underneath something else in the head. So there's basically, the implementation creates a pseudo DOM node, and it uses that before and after to create like a fake DOM node that you're telling React is the root. So something else that's really frustrating working with Next is having in server-side rendering on the server side in your components access to what the request and response is, so you can set the HTTP status codes or something based upon a GraphQL query in your component. It is possible. I actually published Next server context, and I figured out how to do it with Next, but you have to set up a bunch of crap. So this is the type for transfer that's in the context. And here's an example of it. If you want an error page that can set the HTTP status based upon the status prop, it's really that easy. You just read the transfer context, and if there is one, because this context is only populated when you're server-side rendering, you can then modify it however you want. So this is like a whole Meetup talk in itself, so I won't go into it. But a massive differentiator with Ruck and Next.js, firstly, it leans totally into load data anywhere in your component tree. Like Next.js and Remix, they try and push you to only load routes up at the route level. They don't want you to load stuff deep in components. You can set it up with Apollo and stuff like that to do it, but they really make it hard for you, and there's a lot of boilerplate. Out of the box, Ruck actually exports a use GraphQL hook, and it's super easy to create your own hooks from that, an abstraction on that, where you'd create like use my company API hook or use GraphQL GitHub API hook, and then in your components it's super easy to make queries, and Ruck automatically hydrates that data and stuff on the client after server-side rendering. And it works very efficiently. If you wanted to look and poke around with what that data loading looks like, that's the page I suggest you zoom in on. That's basically the component for the page that I demonstrated earlier that shows the GitHub API, GraphQL API powered data about all the Ruck releases that's being rendered. So there are other deeper topics for future talks about, how to customize a server-side rendering HTML template. It's actually like stupendously easy. It's just a serve option, and you just give it a component. But how do best practices around environment variables that are different between the server and client? Because you don't have, again, any build tooling, right, that can do Webpack, what do they call it, substitute plugins or something. Next.js, they've got a whole bunch of their API abstractions and config options and stuff to have different environment variables go into the client builds and stuff. You don't have any of that, and you actually don't need it, it turns out. There's a really simple solution, but it's not simple to explain, so another time. And optimal module design, that really is an important talk, I think, to really get the most out of Ruck. So it took me a year, and I spent a lot of money. So I need to go back to work. I took a few contract gigs lately. But it really, really, really helps because this is my passion. And these GitHub sponsorships actually have made a big difference to me. So that's a direct way that you can help contribute and hire me. So I'm a specialist in GraphQL, Node, Deno, build tooling, all sorts of stuff. Do we have any questions?
Did you use Deno because of TypeScript support, or did you even consider going through one because of native JS support with that?
So the question is, did I choose to use Deno instead of something else like Bun, specifically because Deno has good out-of-the-box support for TypeScript? Bun didn't exist, I think, when I started this. But regardless, Bun, their whole philosophy is built around the concept of build steps. So it doesn't actually give me anything. This is kind of a point I'm shouting from the rooftops and no one's listening. We don't need all of this complexity. I'm not $1 billion corporation. I just sat down and I just nutted it out. I hope a lot of other people publish competing frameworks. The point is, you don't need 100 megabytes of dev dependencies. You don't need to be pulling your hair out, figuring out Webpack config. We're torturing ourselves on purpose. Really, it is on purpose. Deno is all you need, I think, and I really believe it's the future. TypeScript is not, it's nice, but if I had to have separately installed TypeScript to get the editor experience of TypeScript and stuff working, I would happily do that too. Theoretically, now that Node is coming out with HTTP Deno style of and browser style of imports as well in the latest versions of Node, it's all experimental. They're playing catch up. They're panicking. And they've also now rushed out fetch finally after all these years that, once Deno's taking on Node, suddenly, we can do fetch after all. So theoretically, I could actually have a Node version of Ruck. So I kind of not very motivated, but theoretically, Ruck, the concepts, the principles, they're all based upon web standards. So any runtime that supports web standards, dynamic imports, HTTP imports, native ESM, and import maps, they're the big ones.
So I saw you use TSDoc or JSDoc instead of TypeScript. Is that because there might be a build required if you use TS? There would be, I would guess. And the second question I have is around minification. You chose the edge versus speed element, of course, because it's nicer, but also because it's smaller. So would you consider some form of minification on top of Ruck?
I'm going to answer the second question first because I still remember in my head what it was. The question was, actually, sorry, can you repeat it again?
So minification, is that something that you would still want on top of Ruck?
Yeah. Okay, so the question is minification something that you would still want on top of Ruck, even though you could choose to not minify, so it looks pretty. And actually, there was a nuance that I didn't go into, but most of the code that was running for that demo was minified because when you are using a CDN to load React and stuff, those CDNs, React might publish a minified version and the CDN might give that to you. I could have chosen in production to use the development full-blown version of React or something, but generally CDNs is where minification can happen, and it doesn't have to happen on the fly when the CDN's serving it. It could happen at publish, when they might have a minified build artifact that is what they actually publish to the registry, NPM or wherever. You could theoretically minify Ruck. And by the way, you could introduce a build step and use Ruck if you wanted. You could scoop up everything in your project, put it in a source dir, and make your own CLI that minifies it or does anything you want to it in a dist dir. You could do that, but why would you? Yeah. Your first question though, what was that?
Using TypeScript style annotation instead of TSDoc or JSDoc style annotations.
Yeah, so the question is querying the decision to use JSDoc TypeScript flavored comments for the type safety instead of using full-blown TypeScript .ts or whatever in the full TypeScript syntax. And you did point out, one of the obvious examples is that would require a build step then. Technically, Deno doesn't require a build step. At runtime, it can deal with .ts files and syntax just fine. But it's an isomorphic code base, right? So Chrome will crap its pants. I did experiment with having server files .ts and then the stuff that you want to run isomorphically, then you'd use .mjs. And in the end, it was actually better DX using js.comments. You can more easily define descriptions for IntelliSense and stuff in with the types. Obviously, you don't need to do a build step, and you can have a consistent approach, which could potentially, and I haven't really fleshed this out, with linting plugins and stuff that enforce certain code standards and things. I just like the idea of having a universal standard. Any other questions? Right at the very back. Yeah.
What's the next big thing for Ruck?
The big thing is probably around cache header tag headers. So at the moment, any of the stuff that's served from a CDN, they've got pretty aggressive caching headers and stuff. But for assets that are being served out of your public directory, it doesn't have like long living cache like headers or anything on those assets. It turns out I actually quite like that. You're not going to end up with any problems if you redeploy and stuff. Like, I haven't come up with a tricky way to cache bust in file names or anything. There probably is a way that as a user you could think of something built on, abstracted on top of Ruck to do it. But I found I get perfect Lighthouse scores anyway, and I like that everything's fresh. But I do have a GitHub issue for at least using etag headers. I also want to get complete code coverage for Ruck's own test suite. A lot of the obvious things I've got coverage and tests for, but there's some really like integrated tests of like the holistic system working that could take me several months, and I'm not being paid. So if Ruck took off and if there was sponsorship and stuff, I think that would be a big improvement on the code base.
Just going back to my friend here. Preferences aside, you can just use TypeScript, right?
You could use TypeScript, but you would then have to take charge yourself of having a build step. So you'd need to run the Deno's TypeScript compiler CLI yourself to make the source become dist, instead of just being able to just run the source code directly. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah, just here.
Where did the name Ruck come from?
Ruck. So magically, Ruck, I've started looking for a name over a year ago. It was free on NPM, believe it or not. So don't dog me, because it's still free, technically. Please, I beg you to God, don't take it. But the other reason is it's a metaphor, because Ruck is carrying a burden for you, and the metaphor of the rucksack is that it's carrying data to go from point A to point B over the network. And it's also just a metaphor that pleases me because I'm into ultralight hiking. Yeah. Yeah, another question?
Is the logo a bird?
Is the logo, but it's meant to be a backpack. So, sorry. That's the logo. Can you see it? Yeah, I can see the question now. How are we doing for time? Do we have any cut or any more questions? No, all right. I think I'll hand over. Please come and talk to me about it. Sure. So we're going to have a 5-minute break, and then we'll recommence. This is your...
I'm Bas. You can all start coming back to the chairs as the lights go off. Hopefully you've grabbed a drink. Hopefully you are in this room and not still in the washroom. And hopefully you will pretty soon be at your chairs. And hopefully my computer will get unlocked. And yes, thank God. Although it's not duplicating yet. It'll get there. I'm just filling up the void. So hello everyone, I'm Bas. I work at Seek as a principal developer, and this is a talk on Razzle. Raise your hand if you use next.js in production. Okay, that's actually a smaller number than I thought. It's around like 10%, 20% max. How many people use Remix? Okay, and that's 2 people. How many people use just create React app? Okay, so it feels like create React app is fairly popular in this crowd. It's about the same as next.js. So what I'm about to show you with Razzle, which is not my project, it's open source, it's actually somewhere between create React app and next.js. So it's you bring your own server code, but you get to use server-side rendering with something that looks very similar to create React app. It looks so similar that it's called create Razzle app to initialize. And then you can give it a name. I'm going to give it React Melb. And then because I do all things in TypeScript, I'm going to use -- example with -TypeScript. And this will do something very similar to create React app. It'll download the template, extract that into a folder called React Melb. And hopefully it will not take too long, but I will not make you wait that long, because I already have it done. So cd repos, cd demo-react melb, and I will open it up within the IDE that pretty much everybody uses. How many people here use VS Code? Oh yeah, cool. So once upon a time, I wanted to create my own IDE. It's doing a thing that it has done before. So here's a solution to this on my machine. You move it to another desktop, and then it's on focus. But yeah, once upon a time, I wanted to create my own IDE, and then everybody started using VS Code, and I was like, yeah, I'm just going to make a plugin for VS Code if I ever launch a product. That's a whole other talk, whole other meetup. But this is the basic project that is created in the background. It has a package.json, no surprise. It has a few scripts in there for you already. And you can sort of see, if you're familiar with create React app, which a lot of people here actually use, instead of React scripts, you use Razzle. And what this does is it supports server as well as client. And it does that by convention. There is a file within the source folder called server.tsx, and there's a file within the source folder called client.tsx. Now, I mentioned that I use the TypeScript template. Razzle doesn't care, just like, honestly, create React app doesn't care. When it finds a TS file, it will automatically pass that through Babel and use the default Babel transpiler to give you the JS that it has to come out on the other end. So you can actually see that over here, where there's a start TSC command which does run TSC TypeScript compiler under build mode. But if you go into the tsconfig.json, you can see that no omit is true. So TypeScript is there in this project installed purely for type checking purposes. The transpilation, as far as anything is concerned, JSX, TSX, TS, it's all going to go through Babel. Now, when you have a create React app, you basically get Webpack that's going to be run with a config that comes baked into React scripts, and that's what's going to give you the build. With Razzle, it's going to use Webpack for your client as well as your server code. What this means is that you can use hot module reloading for your client as well as your server, and this is something that a lot of people would have done. They would be running 2 instances of Webpack, one for the client and one for the server. Just a question. So how many people have 2 instances of Webpack running, one for the server and one for the client? Oh my God. OK. I don't know if that was a sympathy hand. But yes, some people are doing that. So that's like something that people have to do, or like was conventional, at least with create React app, without using some alternative framework like Skew as an example. But yeah, so Razzle is going to do that. Let's just jump into the demo. While you're doing development, npm start, no surprise, npm start is going to concurrently run start TSC, which is just doing type checking, and then Razzle start. So let's start that up. And then it will do something very nice. It will concurrently run yarn under npm. You can change this to npm, it will be fine as well. But that's just the default template. Let's look at what this URL looks like. And it's a very basic page. The way this is working is, if I actually were to look at the source code for this and go into sources, okay, I was definitely not in the mic before, and refresh under network to see what localhost is returning and preview that, you can see that this is being rendered on the server. And the way that is working is with Razzle start, it is going into that entry point that I mentioned by convention. So Razzle does have a config. You can change these entry points and Webpack options and a number of other things. But the convention is that it's going to launch server.tsx. The server.tsx is something that is going to, which is just an Express app, and you can have whatever server that you want to have, and that'll be handled, that is what will be handling the requests. It comes with Express just in the template. And within Express, you can see that for a request, we are using this function called render app. Within render app, this is conventional React code. This has got nothing to do with Razzle. This is just me walking you through what a server would look like if you were to build a server-side rendered pure React application. It goes into render app, which renders to string using the React function, the app component. It's also wrapping it through static router, which is something that is, if you are familiar with React router, this is your way to render a router on the server. So just in case within your routes, if you have a redirect, you can actually get access to that under this context objects. And this allows this particular render app function to return a redirect on the server without having to render something on the client and the client doing a redirect. That would be weird. But that's just a render to string on the server. And what is it on the client? It is just hydrate, which is a function from React. So that's conventional React. Again, nothing to do with Razzle. The magic of Razzle is there's a server.tsx and there's a client.tsx. The server.tsx we've seen is what is returning this thing, and the client.tsx is what is hydrating that thing to be like this. Let's show hot reloading. I am going to move this back over here, and hopefully I can tab between the two. Cool. Let's go into app.tsx. You can see that it's a React router DOM rendering the home component, going to home. Let's just change it to hello React Melb. Save this, and you can see that that's client reloading. But you could do that with create React app. Why are you using Razzle? Well, you have your own full server over here as well. I could go into server.tsx, and I could add a new route. For example, another GET request for hello Melb, and for the request, which I will not care about, and a response, which I will care about, I will do response.send. Let's send some object. Hi, how are you? And go into localhost, the same URL that's running our client-side code. We go into /API, if I did API, which I did not. It's fine, don't need to have it, but I like that. Hello Melb. Cool. So that's live reloading your server-side code for you as well as client-side code. Any questions up till this point? Cool. I will now show, like, if you want to deploy it to production, what would you do? You would run build. What is build going to do? We can find that in our package.json. It is going to do a TypeScript build just for type checking, and then it's going to do Razzle build, similar to React scripts build. And then it is going to do a client-side build. You can see compiling client code, and then it's going to do a server-side build, which was pretty fast. And it's basically generated two things within the build folder. There's a server.js, which is your server-side code bundled, and then your front-end code from client bundled into the public folder or somewhere. if I can find it. Yeah, public static JS client with the hash. And if I were to run this right now, it would be like there's a command over here you can see over here as well, start prod. So just to do that, npm run start prod. You can see that it's going to run node build server.js, which we saw before, and then that particular server.js is going to start serving this client. So we have the same thing running on production as well. And yep, that's it. You have a server-side, client-side rendered app with one script instead of using next.js or Remix. Any questions? Yes?
Is this the same Razzle that's been around for like 5 years and then died for a couple of years and then I guess has made a comeback now?
I don't think it's made a comeback. But a lot of people didn't know about it. I don't know. Raise your hand if you knew about Razzle before. Yes.
Have like zebra stripes in the logo and
Yes, it does. Yes. This is the project. Razzle React. Can't really see it. Oh, you can see those stripes. Question, go ahead.
So, what does this fix? Like, what challenges does it overcome, do you find?
So it fixes the problem of having to run your own Webpack. So you can see that we are running the server as well as the client-side code on the same port 3000. So otherwise, you'd have to set up cores as an example, just to do local development as well, and then you'd probably have to run on 2 different ports. Sorry, you'd have to run on 2 different ports, and because of that, you'd have to set up cores. And then you have to set up your own hot module reloading for the server, which is you'd use something like Webpack for that, and then you're managing 2 instances of Webpack. Yep.
And so does that mean that Razzle is doing all this for us?
Yes.
Okay. Nice.
Any other questions? Good question, Mother. Yeah, go ahead.
what do you prefer about Razzle over next.js?
I was going to say this at the end. Use next.js. This is a learning talk. And I want to shout out to Jayden as well, because when you watch something that makes you feel uncomfortable or makes you feel like maybe this is wrong, that's a sign of you learning new things. Like his talk was so much full of information about so many things. Even if I never used Ruck, there's something that I learned in that. So thank you for that. And that's what this is as well. Like, it's not at the same level, but it's you learning that, this is something, like some people probably learned, people used to run double instances of Webpack. Razzle is something that's been around for a long time.
But is there just even, just a little thing that's quite nice, even
Yes.
overall?
Yes, you are not bound to Vercel. So next.js, this is going public though. This is fine. Is slightly pushing you towards Vercel, and that's fine. It's a corporation with its own, I don't know, whatever money or something else corporations make, and it will do certain things that assumes that you're on Vercel, and it is difficult for other providers to provide the same level of flexibility because they have that tight cohesion. With this, you are in charge of your server. If you like Express, use Express. If you want to use something else, use something else. If you want to use React, use React. If you don't want to use React, you don't have to use React with this. The client and the server entry point and a built-in Webpack, that's all that it provides. You can use Solid.js with this, and that would work perfectly fine as well. You cannot use Solid.js with Next.js. You could, I mean, like, you can do everything in Next.js because everybody uses Next.js and someone's made a plugin for anything. Any other questions? Seek Learning is hiring. I work at Seek. We're hiring 2 senior developers and 2 principal developers. You can send it to bas@basarat.com, or you can find the Seek Learning jobs on seek.com.au. That's pretty much it.